Nestled in the mountains of the largest island in the Cyclades in the Aegean Sea in Greece lies an abandoned Jesuit monastery, a place where prayer, education, and political influence all converged in a nexus point within the Ottoman Empire in the center of the Aegean Sea, a Catholic stronghold of the Pope's men within Muslim territory. But today, it now lays abandoned, silent, but it's not empty, because the story of the Jesuits isn't just about faith, it's about influence, secrecy, and the shaping of nations. In this episode, we're going to walk these abandoned corridors and explain the hidden history of the Jesuits and the myths and legends and conspiracies surrounding them. And this Jesuit monastery, Calamizia, has recently received the go-ahead for restoration. So if that happens, this is the last time you will ever be able to see this Jesuit monastery in this state. In 1773, Pope Clement XIV issued a suppression of the Jesuit order, the Society of Jesus, and that is most likely what led to this monastery being abandoned. Who are the Jesuits? I'm sure you've heard the term Jesuits before, but probably don't know anything about them. They are the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuit Order. It is a Catholic monastic order started in 1540 by Ignatius Loyola. Ignatius died 16 years after the creation of the Jesuit Order, but 82 years after the Jesuit Order was created in 1622, Pope Gregory XV canonized Ignatius as a saint, so he is known as Saint Ignatius of Loyola. The Jesuit order was basically established as a response to the Protestant Reformation of 1517, led by Martin Luther. The Protestants were viewed as heretics by the Catholics. Now, while the Protestants call it the Protestant Reformation, the Catholics refer to it as the Protestant Revolt, and that's why 23 years after the Protestant Revolt or Reformation, under Pope Paul III in 1540, the Jesuit order was approved, and the Jesuits promised unconditional obedience to the Pope, and they later became known as the Pope's men because they would do anything that the Pope asked. And the Jesuits, they had one main aim, and that was the submission of the world to the papacy, because the Jesuits and the Catholics believe that the Pope is the vicar of Christ. And what that means, if you're unfamiliar with Catholicism, is basically that they believe in the hierarchical structure of the universe, that Christ is the king of the universe in God's kingdom, and therefore until Christ returns, there needs to be a substitute, an embodiment of Christ, of that structure, in order to maintain that structure until Christ's return. And that is the purpose of the Pope, to maintain the holy structure of the universe. And so the Jesuits' goal was to bring the world back into that holy structure, back into the universal kingdom, God's kingdom, the Catholic kingdom, Catholic coming from the Greek word katholikos, which means according to the whole or universal, so the Catholic kingdom being the universal kingdom, God's kingdom for all of mankind. And the Jesuits are the Pope's military men to bring the world into submission. We'll get into more about how the Jesuits move in just a moment, but before I said that this monastery was most likely abandoned because of Pope Clement XIV's suppression of the Jesuit order in 1773, but the Jesuit order was later revived by Pope Pius VII in 1814, so the Jesuit order was really only suppressed for about 41 years, and since then the Jesuits have become very successful and very controversial. Well, they've been controversial their whole existence, but the last pope, Pope Francis, was the first ever Jesuit pope. But now the current Pope, Pope Leo XIV, is from Chicago, the first ever American Pope. He's of the Augustinian order, which is a different monastic order. Now enough about the popes, let's talk about how the Jesuits actually moved, because depending on who you ask, the Jesuits are very, very good historically, or they are considered to be one of the nastiest groups that has ever been created. Saint Ignatius was born with the name Inigo Lopez, and he later changed his name to Ignatius, and he is a subject of scholarly debate of whether or not he was a converso, or a Jew that converted to Catholicism during the Inquisition. Now, in April of 1527, Ignatius was imprisoned and tried on the grounds of heresy. I'm not going to go into details of everything that Ignatius practiced, but he was later released and just said he wasn't allowed to hold meetings. And this is before the Jesuit order was established, but he had already created his method referred to as the spiritual exercises. And I'm going to give you some quotes from a book called The Secret History of the Jesuits, which I've been reading alongside a few other books just for this video. Ignatius has said that he needed just 30 days with his method to break the will and reasoning in the manner in which a rider breaks his horse. He only needed 30 days, 30 dias, to subdue a soul, because the Jesuits believed that, quote, this intelligent and willing obedience is the height of freedom, and that in order to be a good Jesuit, quote, the Jesuits are to be in the hands of their superiors as a staff obeying every impulse, as a ball of wax which can be shaped and stretched in any direction. Not only the will, but also the reasoning and even moral scruple must be sacrificed to the primordial virtue of obedience, which is, according to Borgia, the strongest rampart of society. And this is important because, quote, if the papacy was supported by the Jesuits, the whole existence of the Jesuits depended on the spiritual and temporal supremacy of the papacy. In this way, the interests of both parties were intimately bound together. And that's why the Jesuits were afforded special privileges over other monastic orders, like, for example, they were allowed to deal in commerce and banking. And the Father General of the Society of Jesus is referred to as the Black Pope because he has so much freedom and power over how the Jesuits move. Basically, the way that a lot of people refer to the Jesuits is as the CIA of the Vatican. And what makes the Jesuits really special as a monastic order is that they were heavily involved in politics. In fact, it's said that politics are their main field of action. And some people even said that you would, quote, not find more able, cunning, or daring outside of the Society of Jesus when it came to intrigue, propaganda, and even open rebellion. Now, the Jesuits have been kicked out of quite a few countries, but not everybody has bad things to say about the Society of Jesus. There were many kings and people of power that were very fond of the Jesuits, and of course, the Pope generally is very fond of the Jesuits. And since their goal was to submit the world to the papacy, they had, quote, two very important weapons: to be the confessors of the mighty and those in high places, and the education of their children. And now to quote from the Jesuits by Malachi Martin, never, wrote an 18th century German theorist Novalis, never before in the course of the world's history has such a society appeared. The Roman Senate itself did not lay schemes for world domination with greater certainty of success. Within 30 years of his founding, the order, his Jesuits were working in every continent and at practically every form of apostolic and educational field. Within 100 years, the Jesuits were a force to be reckoned with in practically any walk of life along which men seek and sometimes secure power and glory. There was no continent Jesuits did not reach, no language they did not speak and study, or in scores of cases develop, no culture they did not penetrate, no branch of learning and sciences they did not explore, no work in humanism, in the arts, and popular education did they not undertake and do better than anyone else. No form of death by violence they did not undergo. The Jesuits were hanged, drawn, and quartered in London, disemboweled in Ethiopia, eaten alive by Iroquois Indians in Canada, poisoned in Germany, filleted to death in the Middle East, crucified in Thailand, starved to death in South America, beheaded in Japan, drowned in Madagascar, bestialized in the Soviet Union. In that first 400 years, they gave the church 38 canonized saints. They had a monopoly in the education of Europe for over 200 years. They were the first body of Catholic scholars who became preeminent in secular sciences: mathematics, physics, astronomy, archaeology, linguistics, biology, chemistry, zoology, paleography, ethnography, genetics. The list of inventions and scientific discoveries by Jesuits has filled endless numbers of volumes in the most diverse fields: mechanical engineering, hydraulic power, airflight, oceanography, hypnosis, atomic theory, internal medicine, sunspots, hearing aids, alphabets for the deaf and dumb, cartography. The list of which these random samples are taken numbs the mind by its all-inclusive variety. Their manuals, textbooks, treatises, and studies were authoritative in every branch of Catholic and secular learning. They were giants, but with one purpose: the defense and propagation of papal authority and papal teaching. So in my mind, it is undeniable that the Jesuits have contributed positively to society. without question whenever it comes to education in many secular fields. But it is also undeniable that they have had influence in politics, made subversive moves, and some people even accredit them with assassinations, and some people even speculate that Pope Clement XIV, the one that issued the suppression of the Jesuits, was actually assassinated by the Jesuits themselves. But this is a theory that cannot be proven, as autopsies are not allowed on the Pope because it is considered to defile his body. But to quote from The Secret History of the Jesuits by Edmund Paris, "But Clement XIV knew very well that by signing their death warrant," that being the Jesuits, "he was signing his own as well. The suppression is done at last," he exclaimed, "and I am not sorry about it. I would do it again if it were not done already, but this suppression will kill me." And it's said that even Pope Clement XIV himself had said that he had been poisoned before he died, because he died 14 months after the suppression of the Jesuits. Now, some sources say that there was an autopsy done on Pope Clement XIV proving that he was not poisoned, but other sources say it is the official Vatican position that they do not and have not ever performed an autopsy on a pope. Now, I know that's a lot of history about the Jesuits, even though it barely scratches the surface, but it's important to understand a little bit about how the Jesuits were moving so that you can come to some ideas and make up your own opinions about what you think actually happened at this monastery, which, like I said, was most likely abandoned because of the Jesuit suppression. So this monastery is said to have been built in 1673 by a Jesuit monk, Robert Saus. 1673, that is right in the middle of the Ottoman Empire, whenever all of Greece was under Ottoman occupancy, Turkish occupancy. So what you need to understand about this is in the late 1600s and the early 1700s, the papacy, the Catholic Church, the Vatican, was substantially powerful within Europe and arguably nearing its peak global influence. So to have a outcropping, to have a stronghold in the middle of the Aegean Sea, within Muslim territory, within Ottoman territory, within a super important trade route, you can start to piece together how important this monastery must have been to the Catholics, especially since it was controlled by the Jesuits. And also something else to note is that Greece is an Orthodox Christian country, not a Catholic country. And there's actually another monastery on the island that is from around the same time period that is an Orthodox Christian monastery, because this is all after the schism. But that's a whole nother topic. I want to read you just a little bit of the history of the Ottoman occupation from Naxos.net, so the island's own website. Turkish rule of Naxos Island lasted from 1537 to 1825, when Naxos joined the modern Greek state. The Turks chose not to colonize Naxos and the other Cyclades. Instead, the Sultan ceded the duchy, Naxos Paros lists a bunch of islands, to his protege, Yusuf Nasi, a Portuguese adventurer and banker. Nasi was a former Jew who had converted to Christianity in Venice and adopted the Portuguese name of João Micas. Upon his immigration to Constantinople from Venice, he converted back to Judaism and befriended the Sultan's son. He never set foot in his dominion. Instead, he appointed an administrator of his trust in his place named Francesco Cornelio. His power weakened, and he finally met his death by stoning in 1579. So it's 100 years before this monastery was built. Nessie got stoned to death. In 1580, the Sultan conceded particularly favorable privileges to the Greek islanders. The head tax remained, but they now enjoyed complete religious freedom and were permitted to build churches as they wished, while foodstuffs, silks, and wine were exempt from tax. Sultan Ibrahim confirmed these privileges later in 1640, forming the basis of a constituent charter for the Cyclades under Ottoman rule until 1648. So that's just before this monastery was built. Special trading and other privileges to Western residents of the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century led to the appearance of the Jesuit and the Franciscan monastic orders on Naxos, as well as the founding of the Ursuline Monastery, as was the policy of the Catholic Church. All three orders founded schools on the island. Naxians rebelled against their Latin and Turkish masters on several occasions. All rebellions failed. There's a few interesting things to note from that website. One thing is that Naxos basically was a type of tax haven and had religious freedom at the time. And you can read that and just kind of think like, oh, cool, good for them. They had lower taxes. But if you think about that in life, like where today are there tax havens and where today is there religious freedom, and what does that actually mean? What does that mean politically? Because this was in the time of Ottoman occupation, Muslim occupation. So you've got an island in the middle of one of the most important trade routes with the Jesuits, the Pope's men, the Pope's military men who have dying allegiance to the Pope, unconditional obedience to the Pope, moving in politics on an island within quote unquote enemy territory. Think of how that could have been used, right? Like if there was a politician, you could say, come visit our Jesuit palace. That's what the locals referred to it as, the Jesuit palace, because it was very ornate and beautiful compared to local standards. It was considered very wealthy. The Jesuits in general, historically, have been considered extremely wealthy, and they were, like I said, given special privileges by the Pope to work in commerce and banking. You can start to piece some things together and imagine what actually went on within this monastery. Hopefully it was all good things and that it was just a bunch of monks living their monkey life. But realistically, considering the Jesuits are known for political influence, you can imagine it would be a nice thing to say, hey, Ottoman politician, how about you take a nice vacation to this island within the Ottoman Empire, to our nice Jesuit palace, and we can discuss some business. Now, that's just speculation. I have no way to prove that, or anything is completely speculation. But given the history of the Jesuits, how they were moving, you can begin to let your mind run wild. The Jesuits are an organization that are shrouded in obscurity, and when I started making this video, I had only really ever heard whispers about the Jesuits. I had never done a deep dive into them myself, and after having done a deep dive, I found out that there's a ton to learn about the Jesuits, because we're talking about 500 years of operation all across the globe, working within governments. Some people say they toppled governments, toppled empires. They worked alongside kings and queens in anything involving politics. But because of the nature of the organization, how they actually moved is kind of hard to uncover. But it's undeniable that historically the Jesuits had a lot of power, and arguably they still have a lot of power today, and they're the center of a ton of conspiracy theories, many of which that I've looked into I think are actually quite far-fetched to blame on the Jesuits. But that's not to say that all of them are far-fetched, but a lot of them I think are a little bit reaching. But if you want to hear me talk about the Jesuits more, then let me know in the comments, and maybe I can make a live stream about them at some point, because the rabbit holes on the Jesuits are pretty much endless, and it goes in every direction that you can think of, and even directions that you wouldn't think of. So let me know in the comments if you want that content. And if you like the content, if you like the channel, the best way for you to support is to buy Captain Salve. It's the best way to upgrade your skin, your beard, and your hair, packed with herbs, ancient herbs that are good for you. It's made by me. I developed it, and it's the best way to support this channel. So check that out, link in the description. Otherwise, have a great week. I'll catch you later. Big love.